Hi, everybody. This is S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com, and I'm really excited to report that I have Eric Hernandez here, none other than Eric Hernandez. I've been really happy to get him on. I've seen him in multiple debates. He's debated Matt Dillahunty, Cy Ten Bruggencate. He's been even picked up, some of his materials been picked up by William Lane Craig. He's running a Baptist group in Texas, and he is a pretty fantastic guy. He's also gotten on shows with Shannon Q and Skylar Fiction and Nick Suter and Peter DeTucker, all these people. So he's gotten around, and he has a really powerful argument in support of the soul and against naturalism. And so without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce Eric Hernandez. Eric.
Hey, how's it going?
Great. So did you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came to apologetics and where you are right now?
Yeah, sure. First, thanks for having me on. It's good to be here. I've heard great things about you, and I've seen some of your stuff as well, and I appreciate what you do. So I am the apologetics lead for the Baptist General Convention of Texas. So the SBC state convention in Texas would be one of them is Texas Baptist, and I basically direct the apologetic conferences that we put together, and that encompasses everything from doing trainings with churches or going in and teaching apologetic sessions, or doing what's called the atheist role play. You may have heard of something like that, which is a real eye opener for people, and doing conversations, online debates, or debates in person, and things of that nature. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And so I just want to say hi to Susan in the audience. She says hi to you. So
hey, Susan.
Susan Slam RN. I don't know if you know her, but anyway, so I'm really excited about this. Let's get into this. So I saw you recently on Shannon Q's channel, and that's probably the most recent one. And I also saw you looking into the soul. So you make an argument. You actually, you're also on David Smalley's show, and we were talking about that a little bit about how you came to do that. Maybe before we go on, did you want to tell everyone the title of that book you're working on?
Yeah, so it's a book that I started working on. It's a long story. As I mentioned before the show, it's put on the back burner. But basically came about. Long story short, the church I was going to, they were trying to make like little booklets or pamphlets for the congregation that kind of maybe simplifies some stuff. And I told the pastor, if you need some help with maybe anything with apologetics, I'd be happy to help. And so I sat down in his office, and I was telling him, some of the things that I can put in there. And he says, why don't you just make a book out of this? And it's a longer story to that, but that's when I started writing it. And you asked to, I just remembered how I got into apologetics. I guess in a nutshell, did you want me to touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, that'd be great.
So freshman year of college, and those who've seen me know the story, but freshman year of college, I took my first philosophy class. Found out later my professor was an atheist. And then second semester, I wanted to take another class because I was really intrigued. I was able to ask questions, whereas in my youth group, I'd get in trouble for asking questions. So it was very refreshing. Second semester, I want to take another class. Everybody warns me, do not take Professor Pena's class. If you take his class, you might lose your faith. He's antagonistic, condescending towards Christians, et cetera, et cetera. And my thought was, sign me up, not because I wanted to lose my faith per se, but, I had questions. But I also believe that if God did exist, then we shouldn't be afraid to learn and seek truth, because anything that's true is not going to contradict who he is. That's assuming, of course, that he exists in the first place. So I knew that in my mind that if Christianity was true, I needed to know why. But at the same time, if it was false, I still need to know why. So the pivotal day for me in class was he walks in one day and he pretends like he's holding up an antidepressant pill. And he says, now religion wants us to believe in something like a soul, which is immaterial. And according to Christianity, it's what goes to the afterlife. And because of the soul, we can have hope of seeing our friends and family that have passed away and relatives and whatnot. He said, but according to Christianity, the soul is immaterial, and it contains, your thoughts, your emotions, your moods, and whatnot. He said, but if the soul is immaterial, then he picks up the pill. He says, how is it that if I took this antidepressant pill, which is physical, how can something tiny and physical affect the immaterial? Because if you got these immaterial things, but yet I can take a pill and it can change my moods and even some thoughts and feelings, how can that be? Because every time we look at the brain, we just see neurons firing. And every time we look at the body, we just see the base elements. We see, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, but you don't find anything like a soul. How do we explain that? He said, well, I'll tell you how it's simple. It's because there is no soul. There is no God. There is no heaven. There is no hell. There is no afterlife. We're just a physical brain and body. And we need to learn to live with this fact and get on with our lives and stop believing in these foolish fairy tales, and after so many more words, class dismissed. And that really shook me, because there's a difference between someone giving me an undercutting defeater to Christianity that would, if true, prove Christianity false. But most of what I heard my entire life up until that point was more, I get more maybe challenges at best that would challenge a belief, but not necessarily disprove it or rebut it. But most of the time, what I hear are complaints, not really objections. Well, God of the Old Testament is X, Y, and Z. Okay, well, that doesn't prove he doesn't exist, right? Even if that is the case. Or, okay, at best, what if we throw out that section? What do you do? Well, the Bible's false. So say, well, no, it's 66 books, not just one, right? So at best, you throw out one, you have 65 more to deal with. Nevertheless, when it came to the soul, it was something that really struck me, because Paul said, if there is no resurrection of the dead, then our faith's in vain, and Christianity is false, essentially. Well, if there is no soul, there can be no resurrection, I would argue. And if there is no resurrection, again, Christianity is false. So for the first time in my life, I hear this objection that, if true, would mean that my faith, what I believe in Christianity, it's false. So it really shook me, and I had a couple of choices. I could sweep it under the rug or roll up my sleeves and dig deep, and that's what I did. Now, getting to the question about how I got into David Smalley's show, going back to the book that you were mentioning, which again, it's on the back burner. I'd like to finish it sometime, but the title that I came up with was "Why I'm Not an Atheist," and the subtitle is something to the effect of "An Analysis of the Logically Inconsistent, Philosophically Incoherent, Unjustified, Self-Defeating, Irrational, Atheistic Worldview." And I'll tell you how I really feel about it later, though. And
yeah, don't beat around the bush.
Yeah, and basically that just kind of came. It has the underlining perspective, basically, that because a lot of times I hear non-believers, well, basically when they talk to believers, what they're really trying to do is, well, do you know about this? Or, well, what about this and this? And they're asking about their beliefs. They're not really presenting a case for whatever they want, however they want to define atheism. That's a whole nother issue. But the position there is no God, I've rarely heard a defense of that. It's really more complaints against Christianity, what we believe. So I said, well, let's turn the tables a little bit and let's look at, if there is no God, what would that entail? What would that imply? What's most logically consistent to believe on that type of worldview? And basically, it's within epistemology, you have things that are what are called epistemic chains. So sometimes a certain belief, let's say belief A, will imply belief B. So if I believe all dogs are mammals, then that would imply my 3 dogs in the backyard are all mammals. However, if there's a belief that would imply a false belief that would lead to a false conclusion, then we can say that base belief is false. So if I believe all dogs are brown, and that would imply that every dog that I ever meet and encounter will be brown, but I meet a white dog, then now my belief is, then my belief was proven false, and therefore that base belief must be proven false as well. So it kind of, and there's a little bit more to it, but basically with the viewpoint that if there is no God, what would that entail? And that's kind of where the book leads into, showing a lot of either inconsistencies or some instances where it's self-defeating. Like, I'm sure we're going to talk about consciousness. And I would argue if there is no God, then the only way to explain our existence is by naturalistic evolution, which is just a physical process interacting with more physical matter to make more complicated chunks of matter. And you're not going to get something like consciousness. Now, without going into the argument, that would then imply then that if atheism is true, then consciousness shouldn't exist. Well, and there are atheists who take that position, like Daniel Dennett, who would say something like consciousness is an illusion. And of course, you can't help but wonder if he was conscious when he wrote that. And the and the irony is that in order to have illusions, you have to be conscious. But and then someone like Alex Rosenberg, I think, who William Lane Craig debated, who would even say something like, well, I don't have any beliefs. Well, do you believe that, right? But he's consistent within that naturalist paradigm that if all things are physical and if consciousness is not physical, then you shouldn't have consciousness. But we are conscious, so that would show that, therefore, I would say atheism isn't true.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a great argument. And I think we should probably dig into the, you said you had a simple way of presenting that argument too, in case people are, the simple way to argue for the soul. That was the naturalist argument.
Yeah, well, there's so just like any argument, you can get really into the weeds and get really complicated. But like if I had to share it with somebody like let's say I was in a taxi cab or an elevator. So with consciousness, basically, if two things in question are the same thing, then Leibniz's law of identity tells us that they're gonna, whatever's true of one is gonna be true of the other. But if I can show in principle something's true of one that's not the other, they're not the same thing. The illustration I like to give, and this will take a little bit longer than the quick part, but just for the sake of kind of giving a foundation. So suppose I walk into a lab and I see 2 bottles of clear fluid. one says water and the other one says chemical X. And I want to know, are they the same substance? Well, according to Leibniz's law of identity, if they are the same substance, they're going to share the same properties. So I see they're both clear fluids and I think maybe they're the same substance. But then I turn it over chemical X and it says caution flammable. And I think, okay, well, I know that water's not flammable. Therefore, even if I don't know what chemical X is, at the very least, I know they're not the same substance. Now, if there is no God and all we are is physical things, like I usually present it by, if I'm talking with someone, I say, would you agree with me that if atheism is true, or we could just say the belief that there is no God, if that is true, then would you agree with me that we have no reason to expect that non-physical things would exist, like spirits, angels, demons, God, fairies, whatever you want to say? And, usually they'll say, yeah, right. Okay. So, to be fair, I say, so would you agree with me then that if atheism is true, then only physical things would exist, or we shouldn't see any non-physical things? He said, yeah. And one guy said, well, yeah, but like what? And I said, well, I'm glad you asked. If consciousness exists, and then it must be either identical or reducible to something physical like the brain. So now the question is consciousness physical? Is it just the brain? Is it in the brain? However you want to put it. Well, let's use Leibniz's law of identity. Well, take a state of the mind like my thoughts or beliefs, and take any state of the brain, any kind of neurons firing in the brain, a brain state. Well, we know that my thoughts and beliefs can have the property of being true or false, but no region of my brain is true or false. My neurons aren't true or false. We can even go into the argument from intentionality. When I get hungry, my neurons are not hungry. I am hungry, which shows I am more than my neurons. We can all say, so my brain can weigh 3 pounds, but the thought that I'm talking to you right now doesn't weigh 3 pounds. My brain can be 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana is not 7 inches long. These things are in my mind. So we can give a dozen more examples, but the point is simple, that if all the properties of the brain are physical, and we see that the properties of the mind are non-physical and don't match up with the brain, then consciousness, if it exists, is not something physical. And if atheism is true, and that leads to belief that, the most logically consistent belief is that all things would be physical, well, then it would follow that if you're conscious, you shouldn't be an atheist. And I mean, there's more to unpack there if I need to, but that would be a somewhat simplified version of the consciousness argument. And then we can go into arguments that show that I am not my brain and body, because what I do whenever I teach on the soul or have a debate on the soul, there are two basic points to touch on. The first point, which you can give a number of arguments for, is that consciousness is not physical. And the second point is I am more than my brain and body. And from these two, I think we derive that I am a soul. And basically, the reason I set it up that way is because, and this is where it gets a little bit more into the weeds. When you look at metaphysics, when you look at things that have properties, and a property would be something like triangularity or roundness or evenness. These are words that end in NESS or like ALY. Suppose when I'm driving on the road, we know that when properties show up in the world, they don't just show up by themselves. In other words, I don't see redness floating in my room. And when I drive on the freeway, I don't try to avoid hitting the property of redness. Instead, I try to avoid hitting objects that possess the property of redness. So properties, when they show up in the world, are always possessed or owned by something more basic than himself. So if these conscious states and properties exist, the next natural question to ask would be, well, what possesses these conscious states and properties? Because we know thoughts exist, but thoughts have thinkers. Thoughts are grounded in thinkers. So consciousness, these immaterial properties exist. What is conscious? Well, I know I am conscious, and that word I is an indexical word. And now I'm getting more technical. I know you asked for something simple, so stop me when you need to, please. Because I can.
No, I like it.
I have ADHD, so.
No. I think that's great. I wanted to have you keep going, but I have a question coming from Charlie Reed, and I answered it with awareness as far as another word for consciousness. But can you define consciousness a little bit? I mean, do you have another meaning besides sort of awareness, conscious awareness? Yeah.
So consciousness, first and foremost, to understand these things, is consciousness is something that is defined ostensibly, which means it is defined by citing instances or examples of it. So for someone to even understand what consciousness is, they have to have experienced these conscious states and properties. In other words, to give an illustration of defining something ostensibly, suppose you meet someone who was born blind. How do you describe or define the color purple to them? Well, you can't, because they've never had that ostensive experience of purple. So, excuse me. That being said, sorry. When you look at consciousness, it's defined the same way. Now, to help understand, much like water can come in three different states, solid, liquid, or gas, it's still the same substance, it's water, but it can obtain in different states. It can exist in different states. In the same way, consciousness would be defined by its 5 states. So there are 5 states of consciousness. There are thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and acts of will, or you can say volition. So again, there's thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and volition, or acts of will. And that's how I would define what consciousness is.
Oh, that's great. That's and I just wrote that down because I hadn't even looked into that. I was trying to write a little chapter in this book I'm working on consciousness, but I hadn't gotten that far yet, as you can probably guess. So the challenge, the big problem, and Craig Reed's in the audience, he's saying that, the hard problem of human consciousness is, number one, people aren't sure how it originated. Like, how did, if we look at an evolutionary process and this whole idea that we've evolved from primordial soup, which I'm not sure I even buy, but if you look at something like that, and all of a sudden we have these conscious sentient beings that sort of came into existence during maybe the Cambrian explosion, for example. Some of them came into existence. But how do you know? Have you looked at the argument on why that's a problem?
Am I? Yeah, I am unmuted. Yeah. Well, when people talk about the hard problem of consciousness, I always like to kind of say, well, hard for who? It's a hard problem, not for the Christian worldview, because as you said, it's usually, well, why does it exist? That's a problem. Well, it's not a problem for me, right? I mean, if God exists, then he is. You can go into the argument from contingency here that basically, if consciousness exists, and I would appeal to someone like Thomas Nagel and other atheist or agnostic philosophers who would agree that there is something, that consciousness is not just something physical, nor does it arise like a structural property from the physical. And tell me wherever you want me to expand on more later. So Thomas Nagel is going to have to say something like, who would concede that you can't explain consciousness by just appealing to naturalism or naturalistic evolution. It doesn't work that way. It would be like asking this question. If I have a red brick house composed of 1,000 red bricks, how many red bricks do I have to add or take away? And what rearrangement of structure should I give it in order to get the color blue? Well, the color blue doesn't arise from rearranging red bricks, right? Because it's not a structural property in that way. So with consciousness, if it exists, it has to have been there all along. And it just, when I say emerge, I don't mean it in the philosophical sense. I probably shouldn't. It's unlocked, if you will, when you have the right physical conditions in play. But someone like Thomas Nagel is a panpsychist, and he would say that every piece of matter has the potential, when put in the right physical conditions, to become conscious, because it's already within its nature to begin with. And that's even a technical term in metaphysics, talking about natures. But something like that basically is how he would solve the hard problem of consciousness. Well, sure, but if you have a conscious being from the beginning who is the very reason for which any and everything else exists in the first place, then it's really easy to see where consciousness comes from, right? In fact, I've had people, and I find this funny in both an amusing and sad sense. Sometimes when I talk to non-believers, they ask the question, well, can you give me an example of a mind without a brain? I said, sure. God. And they say, well, that's not an example. So, well, you asked me for one. You didn't ask me to give an argument, but if my worldview is true, then sure. The fundamental ultimate reality in which all of reality is sustained, and the reason for which anything at all exists, is because of an unembodied mind. I had a second discussion with David Smalley, and he thought, that was bizarre, that he had never, that Christians believe in an unembodied mind. Well, yeah, it's like, if you miss that, you've kind of missed a huge portion of Christianity. Nevertheless, the hard problem of consciousness is a, quote, hard problem for anyone who's going to reject any kind of a supernatural worldview that includes God. Because if you don't have consciousness there from the beginning, it's not going to be here at all. Well, it is here, so consciousness must have been there from the beginning. Yeah, I know the guy, I call him God.
Yeah, no, I believe you. And I go back to that idea too, because you have to have this, when the universe is formed, mind before matter. it seems like mind comes always before matter. And so there had to be a conscious presence, I would say. And so, so I think, yeah, I don't think it's a problem for us. Have you looked into, because I actually have Christian friends. I have a guy called John Buck, who's a Christian. I think he's Christian at least, but he's into the idea of panpsychism himself, which is basically saying that everything's got some level of consciousness. And what do you think about that? I think it's kind of a unique, weird argument to say that like plants even have some level of consciousness.
Well, so this is where, and it goes from 0 to 60 really quick when you start talking about philosophy of mind. So I would say plants are substances, which is different from a soul, which is especially how we understand it. But I would say plants do have a life principle, is what Aristotle called it. But I wouldn't say they're conscious, especially not in the states that I had mentioned. But there are certain characteristics of a substance that is important to understand. And again, I can go any and everywhere from here, but basically to your question, I think if God exists and you have a worldview that includes God, you don't need to appeal to something like panpsychism, because that's kind of ad hoc in my opinion. There's no reason to appeal to that. And when you get into the metaphysics of what a nature is, a nature, everything has an essence. It has a nature. If I plant an acorn in the ground, within its nature, it has a capacity to become an oak tree. But if I plant my 11-year-old daughter in the ground, she's not going to become an oak tree because it's not within her nature. So it could never arise. Her becoming a tree or growing a root system will never happen, because her nature is what sets the limits of the capacities and faculties within what she can and cannot do. That being said, I don't find anything about the nature of matter that gives us any indication that it has the potential and the ability to at some point unlock the capacity for consciousness. It's just not there. So I think appealing at panpsychism is ad hoc, especially if you have a belief in God in your worldview. And I think it's textbook ad hoc. Well, we know consciousness exists. I don't want God to exist, which is something Thomas Nagel has said on record, and is one of the top 50 most influential atheists in the world. I don't want God to exist. Consciousness exists. So the best thing we can do is appeal to panpsychism, because whatever the case is, anything but God.
See, I'm glad you've actually defined consciousness beyond just awareness, because I think that that's where the panpsychist comes in. They think that it's just awareness, and they think, well, a plant is responding to the sun and its environment, so it must have some level of awareness. But since you added on the 5 different states of consciousness, that actually speaks against the whole panpsychism argument.
Yeah, and especially because, and again, this goes from 0 to 60 really fast. So you have capacities within a thing's nature. So the reason I have a human body is because I have a human soul. The reason the dog has a dog body, because it has a dog soul. And everything, its soul is what your nature is within your soul. So all your capacities are going to be within your soul. Now, the reason I would reject something like awareness as a sufficient condition for consciousness is because, well, if someone's in a coma, it doesn't mean they don't have the capacity to be conscious. It just means at that point they're not utilizing or actualizing that capacity. Or you look, the topic of abortion, prior to unborn child being conscious, are they still human? Well, of course. Why? Well, because within their nature, they still have that capacity to be conscious. So whether or not consciousness is actualized is irrelevant as to whether or not the thing in question is a human being, because as long as it has that nature, then the question of what capacities are actualized is kind of irrelevant. And then even capacities come in hierarchies. So for example, I have the first order capacity to speak English, and I have the second order capacity to speak French. What does that mean? I have the capacity to develop the capacity to speak French. So it is within my nature to speak French. Dogs will never have the capacity, don't have the capacity to speak French. They will never be able to speak French. And even when you look at dog training, like, if I tell my dog to come and to sit and, to jump or whatever, she's pretty well trained. I spent a lot of time with her when I was younger, and I've had her for a few years, but she doesn't understand English. She doesn't understand grammar or sentence structure. She understands sounds and associates it with certain actions. So because that capacity for that level of understanding is simply not within the dog's nature. And we can see that when we study the brain of a dog, we know it doesn't have certain parts of the brain that we do. And I would appeal back to, it's because of the kind of soul it has. The body, J.P. Moreland said, is an external realization of an internal structure. So the reason I have the body I have is because of the kind of soul that I have. And that's why I have eyes and ears, and I can have certain capacities and so forth.
Yeah, I think you can make an argument, because I'm just thinking, as you know, my head's spinning kind of a little bit when I'm thinking of what you're saying, because I'm looking at this idea of apes and gorillas and monkeys and these primates, and I'm trying to think about whether or not they have thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, acts of will. And I mean, we can see that they have desires to go grab a banana, something like that. But this idea of language distinguishing us from them kind of is where I'm going to right now, because I'm thinking of how people try to say we've evolved from apes, and apes don't have the capacities at all that we have, the apprehension of beauty, the apprehension of abstract concepts, and language really is a very big one. Have you given any thought on human exceptionalism with respect to that kind of thing? Wait, I might have lost Eric. Did I lose you? Eric?
Oh, sorry about that. I had it on mute. My fault. Okay.
Oh, no worries.
So I haven't thought of it in the terms that you've put it, but I can say this much in that. So are you from? Well, you're probably familiar with this. I'm not sure if your viewers are, with the notion of a priori and a posteriori knowledge. Whereas a priori is knowledge that comes prior to investigation, we can say, and a posteriori knowledge comes after investigation. So, to understand that a bachelor is unmarried is something I can understand a priori. Without ever meeting a bachelor, I can understand the concept of a bachelor. But contrast something that with something like the sun is hot. Well, that's something I experience a posteriori by experience. That being said, there are a lot I think we can know about the soul a priori prior to any kind of investigations. But I think there are some things that we come to discover about the soul after investigation, and that would be things like what we're talking about. So when it comes to like primates or apes, they're conscious, absolutely. What differentiates us is our level of consciousness and our capacities of consciousness. So let's look at something like a dog or a squirrel, because I just saw a squirrel and I do have ADHD. It's outside my window. So I can have thoughts. A squirrel can have thoughts. We can a posteriori see that it does seem that squirrels have thoughts. However, I can have thoughts about my thoughts, and I can have beliefs about my beliefs, whereas the squirrel only rises and my dog only rises to capacity of thought, but not in an abstract thoughts about my thoughts or beliefs about my beliefs. So while a dog can rationalize and think and believe, it cannot rationalize about its rationality. It cannot think about its thinking and have beliefs about its beliefs. That's a higher order level of capacity when it comes to consciousness. So while every soul is made different, I'll put it that way. Every nature, human beings all have the same nature and capacities. Whether or not they're actualized is a separate question. But what it means to be something literally is a question of metaphysics. What does it mean to be a human person? Well, to have these capacities. So if something lacks those capacities, it's not a human person. To simplify it, look at the number 2. An essential attribute of the number 2 is to be even. So if the number, so it's metaphysically, logically impossible for the number 2 to lose the property of evenness, because if it's not even, then it's just simply not the number 2. So that being said, every animal, everything that we know is conscious, I would say we can automatically check it has a soul. And knowing more than that, as opposed to knowing more than that, such as like what level or capacities that they have, to what degree, that would be something I think would have to come a posteriori after a type of investigation. Some animals do show, like gorillas, apes, they do show to have a lot of similar to us. Now, again, to what capacity, I'm not too sure. I haven't looked too into it. Some people say that things like elephants have shown to even mourn the loss of family members and whatnot. That's fine. That's great. Doesn't affect it either way, because again, we know that is evidence of a soul, and it's just a question of to what degree their capacities within their soul and nature, to what degrees do they have that?
Yeah, I was just thinking of, I just saw this thing on, actually, I just read it. I found this really great study that was on Blackfin, and it was talking about SeaWorld and the idea of separating the orcas from their mothers. That was initially how that one orca that attacked that woman at SeaWorld and drowned her,
Wow.
had already done that same exact thing. But the SeaWorld, the idea with Blackfin is when you take the baby away from its mother, it started panicking and initially, actually, before it attacked that woman, it attacked somebody else at a different sea land or something like that it's called. So you do see a little bit of that in animals, and I think we would expect that. A lot of times people try to say how animals have empathy, that therefore it must follow that we evolved to have empathy like animals. And I would say I wouldn't say in a world created by God that animals shouldn't show some of the characteristics that we have, don't you think?
Yeah. Okay, I'm making sure I'm unmuted. Yeah, no, absolutely. It wouldn't show, like you said, it wouldn't show that we evolved from them. And the conversation I had, I think it was last week with Peter Tucker on, I think it's going to go for it. Basically that, so I don't believe in Darwinian evolution. I don't have a problem with it. I just don't buy it. And again, I could care less. It's not relevant to anything I study. And, whether I evolve, from some common ancestor or the earth is young or old, I don't know, but I know I'm here right now. And that's kind of all I care about. I got to pay my bills. So that being said, I think based on what I said earlier, when you look at, and we're going, deep into metaphysics here, when you look at a thing's nature, it's going to set limits to what it can and can't do. And there's a difference between having similar characteristics and capacities of another animal versus saying that our nature derived from their nature, which I think is a logical contradiction when you understand the concept of of a nature. Because if it sets limits to something, well, then you're never ever going to have something else come from that, because those limits are already set. There is no amount of time that you can give me that I am going to have the capacity, or any ancestor I have is going to have the capacity to be planted in the ground, grow a root system, and become a tree, because it's just not within my nature.
Yeah. I think I even think making the argument for God from seeds, and just looking at that, how does a little seed, you put a seed in the ground and it grows into a tree, or it grows into a sunflower or something like that. To me, that's an argument for God, and it's kind of like the chicken and the egg. How did it come about? So which came first, the chicken or the egg? I think we still can't figure something like that out. It's kind of it's confusing. I want to say, going back to your thing on evolution, see, I don't really care about evolution either, and I don't study it. It's not something I'm interested in. I don't care how God put us here, but I do think that even if he did use evolution, that shows to me from some of the stuff William Lane Craig has said that there was some miracles involved, if it's possible to actually bring us about from primordial soup. But I also go back to what Hugh Ross said that's pretty interesting, is he was looking at the days of evolution as epics, and I'm sorry, not the days of evolution, the days in the Bible and Genesis as epics. And he was looking at this idea of the sixth day, and in being right around the Cambrian explosion perhaps, and then the seventh day being the time of rest. And he noticed that in the Cambrian explosion, we had this tons of speciation, tons of different forms of life coming about. We don't have a lot of the transitory fossils apparently during that time to explain these different forms of life that came about. But then he talked about in the seventh day, in the period of rest, we really haven't seen any new species come about that are larger species, maybe some small ones, but it seems like God's in this day of rest right now, which is kind of a fascinating thought to just sort of entertain.
Yeah, and this goes into, and this is a problem when I get into these discussions, I love to go in and everywhere. And like I said, having ADHD doesn't help. This goes into even what's known as the Traducian view of the soul. And I don't know if you're familiar with that. For the listeners that aren't, so there are, so we can ask a question, well, where does the soul come from, so to speak, or when does it originate? Or the pop level way of asking the question is, at what point does a soul enter the body? I think the entire question presupposes that there exists a body prior to a soul. Tell me when to stop and when to, unpack.
No, keep going. I'm just trying to piece it together here.
Because what I'm about to say, I'm trying to think the best way to say it, because like I said, 0 to 60. So on the creationist view of the soul, to oversimplify it, God looks at a fertilized egg and says, yep, those conditions look good to me. Let's zap that bad boy with the soul. And that's the creationist view of the soul, which is interesting. I won't go into the backstory. I had a short discussion with JP Moreland on this, but if the creationist view of the soul is true, then God is not resting. He's still creating every single time someone's conceived. Contrast that with the Traducian view of the soul, which again, it would take a lot to unpack, but the simplest way to think about it, and this is going to open up just more questions, I know, is basically that God has instantiated the world in such a way that he's set it up in that when two things come together, there can be a substantial change, and the soul, the biological matter, such as what we have, would have what he calls soulish totipotentiality, that when you get the right conditions met with this biological matter that is infused with soul, like my body is infused with my soul. When I wiggle my finger and wiggle my toe, it's not like I wiggle my finger and I have to wait, a millisecond for my soul to travel from my finger to my body. My soul is omnipresent to my body. It's all throughout my body. And when you get a mother and father who love each other, or, two people of the opposite sex, they can reproduce, because that's how God has set up the world. So Moreland told me that this is actually an argument implicitly presented in Genesis, which is an apologetic position, not against non-believers, but against the pagans, who said in order for our crops to grow and for there to be reproduction, we have to have these ritual sexual activities to please the fertility gods. And they said, no, God set up everything that it's going to produce after its kind. So you can only produce what is already within your nature to reproduce, and God has set it up that way. So he doesn't have to, quote, zap these embryos with souls. He set it up the way such that a soul is actually what drives a body ontologically speaking. And I'll stop there, because again, it can go a lot deeper than that. But right, so something like what you're explaining that Hugh Ross mentions, that I can buy that, for the most part at face value, because you have God creating things and then from there allowing them to reproduce after their kind, and whatever's within that nature, which we may not have exhaustive knowledge of, but we can see in a posteriori sense that, oh, okay, then that was within its nature to produce these kinds of things and whatnot.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating stuff. It really is. And it's something to think about. I think about the phrase in the Bible that says, before you were born, before you were formed, I knew you, or before you're formed in the womb, I knew you, something like that. So that speaks to this idea that a soul could have a presence prior to well, actually, it could also just speak to God's omnipresence in one way, but it's also, so it's just interesting to think about that kind of stuff. I also wanted to ask you what you think about near-death experiences. Have you ever looked at, because to me, that's another argument for consciousness, when you have people being conscious and experiencing something outside of their bodies.
Yeah. So, and I'll first say, so to clarify, I'm not saying that the soul exists temporally before the body, but I'm saying ontologically speaking, which is a bit different for those who understand philosophy. You have to have the soul prior to the body in an ontological sense. Should I touch on that really quick? I don't know.
Yeah. Say what you're expanding on that.
So, when I teach on the soul, and I actually have, a class, and I have at least an hour or so to teach on this, which I do at the conferences we put together, or when I go to church, if they ask me to teach on this topic, I'll take at least an hour. And one of the things I differentiate is the difference between a substance and a mereological aggregate, which is basically the big word for saying a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. There are key differences between these two. Here's one key difference. For substances, they maintain identity throughout change and part replacement. For aggregates, that's not the case. Here's an example. Take a purely physical object like a tricycle. When you remove one of the wheels of a tricycle, it is no longer a tricycle. It is now a bicycle by definition. Which now this tells us something about the metaphysics of an aggregate, namely that its existence and identity necessarily depends on the existence of its parts and structure. Now, contrast that with me. If you were to take off my arms and legs, am I still a person? Am I still human? Absolutely. Well, then that shows us that my existence and identity as a human person is not necessarily dependent on those parts and that structure. Now, this goes into what I was saying before the show, where you can get into simple arguments, in my opinion, simple for the soul, when you say, okay, I'm either an aggregate or I'm an immaterial substance. Which one am I? Well, if you can show, let's say, identity through change. Well, I'll give you the shorter version. And again, if you want me to unpack more, you let me know. I am either a purely physical aggregate or an immaterial substance. Well, if I'm just an aggregate, then I do not maintain identity through change. So the question and answer is, do I maintain identity through change? And that's a strict sense of the word in philosophical sense. We can put it this way. So we already know that something like a tricycle isn't going to maintain identity through change. You remove the parts, it becomes something different. So let's suppose it's alleged every 7 to 10 years that you replace almost every cell in your body. Now, let's say 7 to 10 years ago, I committed a murder. This is not a public confession. This is a hypothetical. And let's say that they just now find the evidence for that. And the cops show up to my door and say, Eric, J. Warner Wallace shows up and says, Eric, we got the evidence. We know you did it. And I say, well, time out. Don't you know we're just a physical brain and body, an aggregate? And whatever person you're looking for that committed that murder was someone else 7 to 10 years ago. Go look for that guy, but good luck, he doesn't exist. Of course, they're going to laugh at me. It's not going to fly in court, and I'm going to get arrested because I think we know that we maintain identity through change. A lot more that can be said, but if we do maintain identity through change, going back to the syllogism, I'm either a purely physical object, an aggregate, or an immaterial substance. If I am a purely physical aggregate, I do not maintain that identity through change. I do maintain identity through change. Therefore, I am not a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul, an immaterial substance.
Yeah, no, I like that argument. And it gives me a lot to think about. I think I might have heard you say something similar to that in one of these other debates that I've listened to. So this idea of the bike and taking the bike park. So that's really an interesting thought. And it's also interesting just to think about, as we're an aggregate, arms, legs, that kind of thing. And if you didn't have your arms and legs, you'd still be capable of thinking and a soul. So you still have your soul.
With my debate with T-Jump, we got into that. And then I did a debate commentary review on that that people can go watch on my channel. Where he actually concedes, and you have to, if you're going to go to physicalism and there is no soul, then you don't maintain identity to change. That's just the logical outcome of that position. And I even said in my commentary review, I said, you either accept the conclusion of your position or you change your position. It's that simple. But no, he bit the bullet. And I said, are you the same person from one moment to the next? I had asked a few times and eventually said, no, in the metaphysical sense, strict sense, I'm not. I said, okay. And I said, okay. So how many times have I been talking to in the past hour and a half? I'm just curious. And he didn't like that too much and never gave me an answer. And he said, it doesn't matter. I said, I'm just curious. How many? 5, 10, 15 times? How many? Nevertheless, yeah. So, and there's more arguments like that show I'm either an aggregate or an immaterial soul. And again, we can touch on that later. To your question about near-death experiences, I find them fascinating, and I think there's really something to them. There's a book that Moreland would recommend called is it Imagine Heaven? It's a book by John Burke. I forget the exact title, but maybe I can just Google it real quick. But it's a story compilation of near-death experiences. Yeah, Imagine Heaven, near-death experiences, God's promises, and the exhilarating future that awaits you. Goes over some well-documented near-death experiences. And there are lots and lots of cases. Now, do I think every single case is legit? No, of course not, right? If someone were to tell me I think I went to heaven, my first thought is going to be skeptical. I'm going to ask questions. But what you find in the cases that are verified, and there's different criteria for that. But put it this way, when you have someone who was born blind that's never seen something, come back and say, I saw this, that, and the other, and not even know how to describe light because they've never seen it. Even describe something like freckles. What they were describing sounds like freckles, because someone could say, well, maybe they were just trying to image what they have felt, because blind people, they can feel your face and that's their way of seeing, if you will. But you don't feel freckles, right? And then there's a lot of other interesting cases where things that could not have been known were known. Now, let me first say this: whether they're true or not doesn't disprove the soul. If they're true, I would say, yeah, it would prove a soul. If they're not true, it doesn't disprove it. So it's not something that nothing hangs on that. And if we have the resurrection, then of course we have someone who went to the afterlife, and that's more than something physical. But there's some really interesting cases, like a case where a lady was, I forget her name, Pam something. Basically, she had this tumor in a certain place in her brain that you really couldn't operate on, because if you cut it, the person would bleed to death. And at that time, I think there were only like 2 doctors in the entire world who did this kind of surgery, because it's a very technical surgery where basically they put you under and they drop the body down to a certain temperature, very cold, and they like turn you upside down or something. Basically, they cut you open and they drain every ounce of blood out of you. And then they only have again, don't quote me on this, but they only have like a 30-minute window to do this operation, because the bodies, they almost freeze the body, take all the blood out, Then they have like a time window where they can do the operation, and then they have to put the blood back in and slowly bring the body back up to temperature. It's a very hard, strict procedure. And again, only 2 doctors in the world ever are licensed to do something like this. Well, she came back and said that she saw this, that, and the other, and began to describe the procedure. Now, what's crazy about this is that you're not going to see this procedure done in a movie, because not hardly any people know about it, much less how it's done. There are only 2 people in the world who know how to do this, and the certain kind of tools that are used. And she describes stuff like, well, yeah, he put out this thing that looked like an electric toothbrush. And and that was the way that they, like, I think, sawed her skull or something like that, where, usually people who, because they've done like, try to do studies or try to, I guess, like blind questionnaire where, like, well, how do you think an operation is done? And most people are going to talk about a saw or something like that. She talked about an electric toothbrush, which is exactly what they use, and they show you the instrument. Anyways, something like this, where I think that's fascinating. There's even, and these aren't like happy-go-lucky stories all the time. There was one instance which I teared up when I heard. Again, I may be missing the details, but the overall part of the story is that there was a little girl who passed away or drowned or something, and later on began to talk about possibly going somewhere or seeing something. Her parents just kind of thought nothing of it. Maybe she was hallucinating, oxygen deprivation, whatever. And one day, it was like during a Thanksgiving meal or something. And I'll try not to tear up when I say this. Let's say the girl is anywhere between 5 to 8 years old, and she just kind of said something, and her parents were like, "What are you talking about? Or how do you know that?" It's like, "Well, my sister told me." And the mom and dad were kind of like confused, like, "Well, you don't have a sister." And they're like, "Are you talking about like your cousin Stephanie? Like, you mean like that?" And he said, "No, like my sister." And the mom got really quiet. Again, I'm gonna try not to tear up. I'm a crybaby for stuff like this. And basically, they were trying to figure out what she was talking about. And then she said, "Yeah, my sister, she told me that you sucked her out of your tummy."
Oh,
Wow. The dad didn't know this. I don't know if it was from an affair or what. I don't know, but the dad didn't know this. And basically the family ended up getting a divorce because of that, especially because it was done with other people around. But something like that, I mean, who the mom had never told anybody, she's too young to understand what that is. And anyways, there's just a lot of interesting cases to where these people have knowledge that no one else would have known about, or they would not have known about, have these experiences that you just doesn't match up to any kind of a story had they been under. There are certain conditions for near-death experiences, like, once there's no brain waves and the heart stops for this long, then we know there is no conscious activity and such like that. But I think they're very fascinating. Gary Habermas and Moreland have really interesting talks and work on that. And like I said, the book Moreland had recommended when I spoke to him was Imagine Heaven by John Burke.
Yeah, I'll look at that. I wanted to say with the near death, first thing is my mom told me that she had a near death experience while she was having me, while she was giving birth to me. She actually saw her body from above. She didn't go anywhere or anything besides staying in the hospital room, but she actually somehow was out of her body, viewing her body. And she said it was the weirdest experience. And then I have, there's a woman called Betty Eady, and I remember she wrote a book called Embraced by the Light, which I picked up when I was in my 20s. Somebody gave me that book, and she had a really cool story about going into heaven and some of the things that she experienced there. So I would actually recommend that. But on your point, to talk about a person who says something that they couldn't have known, is there's that book, Heaven is for Real, with a little boy who went to heaven in his dream, went to heaven in a near-death experience. And he actually, just like what you said, he met up with his sister who was miscarried. The mother had miscarried the sister, and the sister didn't have a name, and she told him she didn't have a name. And so when he came back down and he started talking to the parents, he didn't know there was a sister who had miscarried. It was just something like, so he brought that up to the parents, and the parents just were shocked. And he said, "But you haven't named her yet. She doesn't have a name." And so the parents gave her a name. That gets you kind of a little choked up too.
Yeah. And there was, and just to any skeptics listening out there, and I hope everybody's skeptical of it, by all means we should be. There were a few cases, and I think there was a popular case where the boy recanted. I'm not sure if, I don't think it was that one.
It wasn't that one. It was a different one though, but I did hear that.
Yeah. And so, we take these things with a grain of salt first and foremost, but when you do have corroborating evidence, when you have doctors signing off, and I mean, in fact, one doctor said that the testimony that this person gave about their near-death experience and how the procedure was done, the doctor said on record, "I could have used her testimony of what she saw to teach a class on how to do this. That's how accurate it was. And of course, we can't really make doctrines out of these things, but you do find a very common thread throughout all of these verified stories. What's really interesting too is because some atheists will say, well, when you have these near-death experiences, you see the God that you believe in. Well, no, that's actually not the case. In that book, it touches on this. What you will have is, let's say someone who is of a different religion. Usually people would describe seeing some kind of a person made of light, a very, very bright person. And what oftentimes happens is they say, oh, that must be the God I believe in. But they don't necessarily say, yeah, in other words, put it this way. There is no verified stories of someone who went to the afterlife and saw a person with blue skin and a bunch of arms. That's never been, even people of other religions say they see this person of light. I spoke with a pastor not too long ago. I spoke at his church. He expressed to me his near-death experience. Won't go into details, but he was a Muslim. And that's another interesting thing is that, it seems that Christ appears to some Muslims over there. In dream, I've talked to a handful of Muslims that have told me similar stories, but basically he said that he sees this being of light and he says, who are you? Who are you? And this being of light just kind of waved to him, kind of like this, like follow me kind of thing. And he kept asking, who are you? And this person, he tells me the story. He was pronounced dead, and in the morgue, they heard him screaming, who are you? And they came to see that he actually wasn't dead. So I don't know what happened, but they pronounced him dead. And then so many hours later, he's screaming, who are you? They resuscitated him. He didn't tell anybody. That's another thing. A lot of people don't tell these things right away because people will think you're crazy, obviously. Nevertheless, he had some missionaries. This was, I think, in Africa. He had some missionaries come talk to him and share the gospel with them. And he had this moment to where he stopped them and said, that's his name, Jesus. That's his name. I never knew what his name was. And what are you talking about? And he shared the near-death experience with them and says, the guy you're talking about, I met him. I just didn't know his name. So now I know his name's Jesus. But yeah, I mean, a lot of interesting things like that.
Wow. Yeah, that is interesting. That's really interesting. And I think that people should look into those because they've said that most people, if in these near-death experiences, most don't have this experience where they go into heaven. I think it's around 1.4% of people have it where they report that they actually were in heaven or they had some heavenly experience. But then there's the flip side, the ones who have the hellish experience. Have you heard about any of those?
Yeah. So, yeah. And those two, I mean, there's, again, I would point back to that book. I mean, there's a number of really interesting things, especially one instance where a guy says that what he says, the demons that were doing to him, they were abusing him in ways he didn't want to describe. And a lot of times people don't like talking about this. And they rarely talk, especially those experiences. They're very traumatic. And obviously, whether you believe the person did experience, whether you believe the person actually went to heaven or hell or not, it's demonstrably obvious that they are traumatized by something they claim to have experienced. And basically, he said the demons were both physically abusing him, and he didn't want to describe what, but also it was emotionally abusing. And he described it this way, which gave me chills. He said, in fact, he welcomed the physical abuse because it was a temporary distraction from the emotional mental trauma he was experiencing. That's how bad it was. So yeah, those aren't always happy-go-lucky stories. My father, when he was younger, I forgot what had happened, but he says he does remember, just falling somewhere that was hot. It was like a bottomless pit he was falling to. He didn't describe, and he wasn't there long. And we haven't shared the story or publicized it. So you have a lot of these stories that aren't even public knowledge that people don't know about because it's just kind of weird. But yeah, not all near-death experiences are happy-go-lucky. A lot of them are traumatizing. Some of them people go to hell. And in some instances, you have things like kids knowing things that one of the parents that causes something like a divorce. So if these people are making it up, they're making up some pretty accurate stuff. And in some instances cause unnecessary, pain or trauma or things like that.
Yeah. And what you're saying though is so true. A lot of people won't even admit that they had something like that. They feel like somebody will call them crazy. And it reminds me of something that it also happened to one of my graduate students. She actually had gone through some traumas, and one of these traumas, she had a near-death experience. She pretty much had been completely, somebody was trying to suffocate her to death. And this person basically pretty much it turned her eyes completely red and purple with blood and that kind of thing. So she had this experience where suddenly she's in this state where there's this woman who's trying to get her to go with her and to, you know, come on, run with me, run with me, run with me. And so she's having that kind of experience. And then suddenly she came to and she was alive again. But it reminds me of one that I saw in a YouTube video of a guy who says that he was in his hospital room and all of a sudden he died essentially in the hospital room, and somebody came into the door and said, come on, follow us. And initially they're really nice to him and they're trying to get him to go down some pathway. And he said it felt like days and days and days had passed in time. And then suddenly he found himself in this place where people started torturing him physically and emotionally, just like you said. And they started, you know, tearing him apart. And he said they had this strange sense of satisfaction the more they ripped at him. And so I just think those experiences can be kind of scary. I like the ones that are going the other way, of course, if people go into heaven and meet their relatives. Oh, that's the other thing that happened on that little one with Heaven is for Real. The little boy met his grandfather, but he met a young version of his grandfather. And he said that there were no glasses in heaven. No one wore glasses. And he saw a picture of the young version of his grandfather. And he realized that, he said, that's who he saw in heaven. And then they also had that same little boy. He also, what else had happened to him? He had something else. He met the glass. Oh, then I know what it was. He saw Jesus and Jesus approached him. And so they said, well, what did he look like? And so people started bringing out all of these pictures of Jesus. And he didn't think that Jesus looked particularly like any of the pictures. But then he saw this one picture that this little girl named Akian had written or had drawn from her own vision. And he said, wait, that's exactly what Jesus looks like.
Yeah, I've heard of that. So it's really interesting. You can look up the picture too. Yeah, it's fascinating. And you know, we could spend a long time talking about that. But even in the picture that she draws, Jesus's hair kind of looks like weird, like he was having a bad hair day. But what a lot of people describe is like this light emanating from this person. So being a child and seeing these things, you know, you could, what you're drawing may be a representation of what you see, which may not, in other words, Jesus didn't have like a perm or straight hair. You know, you have this frizz. What is a frizz? You know, well, some people think, oh, that could be that the light that she was trying to describe, you know, the word, you know, maybe she didn't see where the distinction of the hair, whatever, from the light, where that line was anyways. But yeah, it's there. And even that, I think it, in my opinion, lends some validity to it, in that, you know, these people aren't just drawing what they've always seen. They're drawing things that may look unusual, but when you kind of unpack why they drew it this way, it makes sense. You know, they are drawing what they claim to have experienced.
Yeah, I just want to, Susan saying that the boy from Heaven is for Real recanted. I didn't hear that. I heard a different little boy in a different story recanted. I don't think the Heaven is for Real one did, but have you heard anything on that? Because I hadn't heard that.
It might have been that one, because so there were a few that came out around that time. And I think one of them was recanted. One of them was not recanted and did have some type of proof behind it. I'm not sure which one it was, like you're saying, because I think, you know, people saw that, oh, this kid's getting popular and making money, so someone else tried to do that. But the little boy did end up recanting. I'm not sure which one of those boys or girls did, but, you know, if someone recants, so be it. You know, you still have a bunch of other cases. And again, like I said, this doesn't prove that there is no soul. If it were false, it would just take away some reasons we have that may give validity to what we believe.
Yeah. So what, let me ask you this. What do you think is a good argument for Jesus? If we have the arguments for the resurrection and that sort of thing, because there's different choices. There's the arguments from prophecies, or the arguments from like Gary Habermas's minimal facts, or the undesigned coincidences in the Bible. Do you have anything that you think is great aside from your own personal experiences?
I go with something like what Habermas would represent, or what Craig would present. You know, the explaining the facts. You have like something like I know the empty tomb's not, I don't think it's part of the minimal facts, but I know Craig brings this up. You have like an empty tomb, the belief of the people who started this movement. You know, you're not going to die for something that you know is a lie. You have enemy attestation that the tomb was empty. Just different facts that revolve, you know, someone like Paul, who is persecuting Christians. Now he's a believer because he claims to have seen the risen Lord. Now people can try to psychoanalyze, but I think that gets into a lot of ad hoc stuff. And even if you can psychoanalyze Paul as just feeling guilty and wanting to become a Christian, that doesn't explain the empty tomb. It doesn't explain the other apostles who claim to see that. So there are just a lot, I think, of proof and evidence we have from history that the best explanation would be that Christ rose from the dead.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I do think the apostles' experiences over decades is pretty telling, because you wouldn't do something where you're being tortured. Essentially, they were being stoned, they were being jailed, all this kind of stuff, and not just over a week or something where you could
Right.
possibly bear it, but over a long period of time. So I think that's pretty significant. So I'm looking back. So I would say those are pretty good arguments for Christianity. Do you think the prophecies argument is pretty good too, like Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22 and those kind of things?
Yeah, I think so. It's just not something I've looked into deeply. Life is short, so to speak, and of course, I don't want anyone to hear me saying that's an excuse for not studying something, but I say yes, and I say that with the caveat that I haven't looked into it much, but from what I do understand about it, absolutely. I mean, you read Isaiah 53, and it's like you're reading, if you read that to someone randomly on the street, you might say, where do you think this comes from? They're probably going to say one of the Gospels. I mean, it is, and there is a lot of really, interesting prophecy that you see being fulfilled in the New Testament. And I think someone gave like a probability argument of how improbable it is for one person to fulfill all these prophecies. And I don't know the probability. I'm not the best at math, so that's why I stick more to the philosophy arguments. But no, absolutely, I think there's that is a great argument, especially if you know how to defend and articulate that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think so too. And I think it's funny because that's how I came to know Isaiah 53, because I was raised a Catholic and we didn't really read the Old Testament at all. And I think that's kind of a Catholic thing, although I could be wrong. But so I really wasn't familiar with Isaiah 53. And I happened to be sitting next to a pastor on a plane. And this is after I'd sort of prayed to God saying, I need to know the truth. I really want to know the truth. I find myself on a plane next to a pastor, and he said to me a couple lines from Isaiah 53. And he said, who am I describing? I'm like, well, that's Jesus. What do you mean who you're describing?
Yeah.
And so then I went home and I was shocked. I actually couldn't believe it's in the Jewish scriptures. I saw it I found a Bible. I looked it up in the Bible, and then I went into the Jewish scriptures, and I'm like, how are they getting past this? This is so clearly Jesus. And I found out from Jews for Jesus, apparently a lot of them, they don't read that particular passage in their weekly readings. They hold it out. And so one of the ways that Jews for Jesus has converted a lot of Jewish people is simply with that passage.
Wow. Yeah. And it even, I don't know if it's in that passage, but it says that you'll look on basically God who you have pierced.
Yeah.
And because some of the arguments are like, well, you can't, God doesn't have a body, or God isn't this, or God can't die and whatnot. You hear Muslims saying that. But for someone who accepts the scriptures, when you say you look at God who you pierce, well, how do you pierce God if he's an incorporeal being? So yeah, there's a lot that points to. And I have a friend who knows Hebrew and can read Hebrew and can speak. I don't know if I'd say fluent. I'm sure if he brushed up, he could. But yeah, he's told me some really interesting, just the way you see Christ in the Old Testament and what he did, like, when he reads a scroll and, he's basically saying, I am salvation and you have to come to me. And that's what really upset them and stuff like that. But yeah, there's a lot of, it's fascinating. I mean, of course, I think when we get to heaven, we're still going to be learning. I can't wait. So there's a lot of exciting stuff. And I find it funny when non-believers either say Christians are dumb, or they say, oh, Christians do philosophy to try to just philosophize and try to make God up. Well, are we dumb or are we overcomplicated? Which one is it? Are we reading too much into things and studying too much and reading too many books in order to come up with something, or are we just ignorant and believe in fairy tales? Which one is it? Is William Lane Craig getting 2 earned PhDs because he wants to believe in fairy tales and he's dumb? Coming from a YouTube commenter, I don't know which one of those two I'd believe, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think people like William Lane Craig really bother some atheists because they're trying to craft a narrative that we're dumb, and people like that who have 2 PhDs know clearly he's not dumb. So
if you're smart, then you're just overcomplicating things to try to make God up or something. Yeah, it's speaking out of both sides of your mouth. Yeah.
Yeah, but I want to go back to what you said with Isaiah 53, because it's just in case people don't know. Look at Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, and Zechariah 12:10, because all 3 of those mention this piercing. And now what's really significant about this is they were written 400 years or more. The Psalms is written around the year 1000 BC. They were written hundreds of years before they even invented the crucifixion, before the Persians started using crucifixions. And so it's just this idea of piercing is really significant. And also, in case you guys are in the audience and thinking about this whole stuff, look at Daniel 9, because Daniel 9 says 77 / 7 after the decree of Artaxerxes went out, essentially in 444 BC. So you can add that all up, and it tells us when Jesus is going to be on the planet, and that he was going to be, basically removed. And it doesn't say through crucifixion, but it basically says that he was going to be killed. And that's all mentioned in Isaiah 53. I'm sorry, in Daniel 9. So that's pretty significant.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I haven't looked into it much. I've heard a lot of the stuff that you're saying, and yeah, and of course, someone can say, oh, well, you're reading too hard, looking into it. Well, the because I have people say something like, I had one atheist say, well, I'm not a Christian. You believe in fairy tales? I'm like, no, I don't. I don't believe in fairy tales. So what do you want to talk about next? Or so like, it's like, why do you believe in fairy tales? I don't. What else do you want to talk about? One person said, well, you have talking snakes. Snakes can't talk. And I said, well, time out. Let me ask you this. If God did exist, let's just say if God did exist, could he use a serpent? It's a serpent, not snake, but could he use a serpent to communicate through? Well, I don't believe God exists. No, I understand that. But if he did, could he do this? Yes. Okay. So then the real question is not, can serpents talk? The real question is, does God exist? In the same way, when you look at this prophecy stuff, let's say someone accuses you of, oh, you're just looking too deeply into it and have this conspiracy theory. Well, what time out? If God exists, is something like this possible? Sure. Okay. Well, then the real question is, first, does God exist? Because if he does, he can do whatever he wants. And he can do something like put prophecy so accurate that we can calculate it and look at something like what you're talking about. So when people just wave away and dismiss those kind of arguments, just say, oh, well, you're just this or that, without giving any real substantial rebuttal to it, then I think they're being intellectual lazy.
Yeah. Yeah. I get that a lot, actually, even on Twitter. People come into my account and they'll write something like, this has been debunked so many times. And I think, where's this debunking? I have yet to see it. You get that a little bit. Do you get that? Have you had any pushback from atheists on Twitter or any place like that?
No, not one bit. No, of course, I find it hilarious. I like to go to my YouTube comments and kind of do a little trolling, I guess you can say. I don't call it trolling. Some people do, but I just think it's hilarious. The kind of stuff, like, for example, yeah, I get people say, oh, that's been debunked. I said, really? I said, yeah, actually, no. Did you know that actually the debunked thing, it being debunked, got debunked? So actually the debunked got debunked. Did you know that? Like, I'm going to one up you. And now, in other words, if all I have to say is it's been debunked and boom, I'm proven wrong. Well, then, hey, did you know that the debunk? So now you're proven wrong. Now we're back to the starting point. Or, and I've had atheists say, oh, you're go kill yourself. You're an idiot, this, that, and the other, blah, blah, blah. And I say something like, could you tell me again how you really feel, but this time don't sugarcoat it, please.
Yeah.
I think it's funny. And there's people say something, oh, you just made assertions. Someone told me that recently. I said, give me an example. In your debate, you just made assertions. Give me the time step, please. Show me where I made an assertion. Well, all of it was an assertion. Well, if all of it was an assertion, open up the video, click on a random spot in the video and give me the time step and show me where the assertion was. Again, a lot of times they're complaints, or they're just, some people I think honestly comment before they even watch the video, because it's like, if you go back and watch the video, what you're saying is actually not true or is responded to. But
yeah. I've got a question coming from the audience here. Stephen Rivard, he says, would Eric think that the Bible equates spirit with conscious awareness of God's creation, awareness of self, awareness of other personal agents, and when we are born again, a personal awareness of the Holy Spirit inside of us?
Yeah, it's a good question. So if the reason this question, if I understand the question correctly, and what it also touches on, the question I get 9.9 times out of 10 when I talk on the soul is, what about the spirit? So I'm what's called a substance dualist, which, to oversimplify, means when we're talking about a human person that's embodied, we can identify two different substances, a material substance and an immaterial substance. Now, some people take a trichotomous view. They say, well, no, there's three substances: body, soul, and spirit. And then they'll accuse me of saying, well, then you reject the spirit. No. So let me put it this way. There are two substances. And as I mentioned before, your soul has different capacities, and everything, every creature, every nature, every like human beings and dogs have different souls within their nature, right? So their very soul is different and has different capacities. So I would say that a capacity of a human soul is to have the capacity or faculty of spirit, and I think it is through our spirit is a way in which we communicate with God. To give it an analogy, I taste with my tongue, not my fingers. I don't taste with my eyes. So my tongue is the medium through which I can communicate to my mind what I'm tasting. My eyes see, not my nose, not my ears, right? So in the same way, my soul has different capacities, and a group of capacities are faculties. So I would say that the spirit is a faculty of the soul by which I communicate with God. So do animals have spirits? I don't think so. So, they don't communicate with God. But whatever you want to call the spirit, I would say it's a faculty of the soul. And just like my tongue is what I use to taste, my soul is what I use to communicate with God. The reason I would reject a trichotomous or tripartite position, because if you're going to say the spirit is a separate substance, and if you're going to agree with me that you communicate to God through your spirit, well, then you have three substances. Which one are you? On the substance dualism, I'm not my body, I'm the soul. Okay, so the soul is me, I, that's an indexical word. I am, when I say I'm referring to my soul. Because I like to put it this way, technically speaking, I don't have a soul, I am a soul, and I have a body. So I have a body, I don't have a soul, I am a soul. And this is where I usually bring in the joke that actually I changed my position because I do have a soul. It's parked in my driveway. It's a Kia Soul, and it's orange. So I am a soul and I have a body. So if you bring in a tripartite view, then you have a soul, body, spirit. And the same question is, which one are you? Well, we can all say, okay, well, I'm not the body. Okay, well, are you the spirit or the soul? Well, if your soul is what contains consciousness, and if you're your spirit, then you'd have to say, well, no, but your your soul contains consciousness. Okay, well, my spirit contains consciousness. Okay, well, then what does your soul do? In other words, you're gonna have to be the captain of the ship. There's only one captain, and there's different parts of the ship. Which one's a captain? Whichever one that is, that's you, and everything else you have is just a capacity within that you as a captain. Because the Bible also talks about the heart. It also talks about the gut. It also talks about the mind. So what do we have? Spirit, soul, mind, heart. Is there a five type of a view? I put it this way. I ask people. So to answer the question first, sorry. Yes, consciousness is more than awareness. The spirit. My soul is what I am. My soul, so I experience awareness. My spirit, is again a medium through which I communicate with God. But I ask people this: how many bodies do you have? They say one. And I say, how many hands do you have? They say two. I say, oh, so you have three bodies. They say, no, I have one body, and my hands are just part of my body. Okay, well then, if you can understand that, then you can understand that I am a soul, and within my soul, I have different capacities.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And so I would probably go to distinguish that too. So I'm looking at the audience. I want to see if anyone has any questions, because we're getting kind of towards the end here probably. But if you guys have questions, I think Eric, Eric, can you tell us what you're working on now? What sort of projects you're working on, or if you've got any upcoming debates?
Excuse me. So with this whole quarantine thing, it's been a little bit harder than usual to try to do the work I want to do, at least. Like this mic is new that I got since quarantine, because usually at the office we have a little studio that myself and Dr. Leighton Flowers, who's my boss, uses. So I just got this in, and I ordered a desk from Walmart, and it keeps getting delayed. And I don't want to vent online, because then I'll jeopardize my Christianity here. But anyways, hopefully it'll come in today. I've been waiting for it for at least a week, but I want to set that up so I can do some work, because what I want to work on is a commentary review on my debate with Scholar Fiction. There's a lot of great material there I think I can use.
That just reminded me of something. I saw you were actually physically present at the IP Aaron Ra debate.
Mm-hmm.
I forgot about that, because actually I reviewed that, a little clip from that with Godless Girl. Do you know who Godless Girl is?
Yeah, I do. I saw that too. I enjoyed that. I think comment on there. Yeah, and I've come to know Godless Girl. Oh,
that's right. You did, yeah.
What I say I like what she says. She seems to be unbiased and objective, from what I can tell. And when I released that Aaron Ra video, she shared it with him, and that was a fun exchange to read on Twitter. And I was at the debate. It was in Fort Worth. I live in Dallas. At the Bible and Beer Consortium, and I've gotten to know Mike over the past couple years or so. We've become pretty good friends, I'd say. But no, it was great. Arn is quite volatile, and you can go watch the commentary review that you're talking about. You can watch your video on it, and then you can see the full video on my channel. I'd encourage you to take a look at that.
It was actually really funny. I shouldn't laugh. I mean, I have a tendency to laugh a little too much, I think, sometimes on these. Eric, Stephen Rivard says, tell Eric that he did a great job with Shannon Q. There was something that Shannon Q asked, though, and I'm forgetting how you addressed this, but let me just ask you another quick question. She was talking about parts of the brain, like when they did studies of rats, and when they take out these parts of the brain, they're removed certain parts of their memories. And so she was connecting that with an argument for the naturalism of the mind, essentially. And so I forgot what you said to respond to that, but you had a good response.
Yeah. So there's a lot that can be said on that. So A few things when we're talking about whether or not consciousness is physical. That's the first preliminary question. Given the argument I gave, first thing we want to do is that I did is show that consciousness is not physical based on Leibniz's law of identity. In other words, if someone's going to argue that consciousness is nothing more than the brain or reducible to the brain, then you're going to have to show they share the same properties. If they don't share the same properties, they're not the same thing. Now, what 99.9% of the people I talk to do is exactly something like you said. And I'm not talking about Shannon in particular. It was a fair question to ask, but as an objection, people usually pose that kind of question. Well, what happens if you remove this part of the brain, you affect this? If you hit, if Alzheimer's affects memory. And I say, sure, not to Shannon, but to anyone, I say, okay, sure. Therefore, what? Well, therefore, taking out this part of the brain affects this part of the memory. Okay, right. That's all you get, right? It's almost tautologous. Now, what some people are trying to say by that, most people are trying to say by that, again, not talking about Shannon Q, but just overall in particular, because I really enjoyed talking with Shannon. And if you're watching the Shannon, thanks for having me on. I did enjoy that. Very respectful dialogue. What they're trying to do is say, well, this proves they're identical. Now, here's where, again, going back to metaphysics, you have to understand there's different types of relationships. There's a relationship of identity. So I am the same person as myself, right? It's a tautology. I am Eric Hernandez. That's a relationship of identity. A is A. But then you also have other types of relationships, like a relationship of dependence. So something can have a dependence of relationship, a dependent relationship, but that doesn't equate or is the same thing as an identity of a relationship of identity being the same thing as. And then you can also have a necessary coexisting dependence. For example, every time I see three angles, I'm going to see three sides. But does it follow that an angle and a side is the same thing? No. Angles are different than sides, but they're always going to coexist when you see them. Does it prove that the same thing? No. Then you have the cause and effect relationships. And this kind of even goes with the dependence. And that's what people are usually pointing to when they talk about something like brain damage or Alzheimer's affecting memory. That's a cause and effect relationship. That is not a relationship of identity. You cannot use cause and effect to establish identity. The illustration I usually give, because, and it's not like some phenomenon we just discovered, because of neuroscience. I'm sure the Aztecs and the Indians, and if there were cavemen, I'm sure they understood that if I hit you over the head really hard, you're going to get dizzy. So it's not as if this is a new phenomenon we discovered that, oh my gosh, wait a minute, the brain relates to the mind? No, of course. So I use the illustration of something like a guitar. Suppose I'm the greatest musician in the world. I'm the greatest guitar player. I'm not. I was a drummer, if anything. Well, if you detune my guitar, it's going to affect the way my music is played. But does it follow that therefore I am a guitar? Well, no. It just follows that my ability to convey and portray my music has a dependent relationship upon the guitar. Now, let's even talk about notes, which I think is more applicable, like a piano or a guitar. If you pluck certain strings or damage certain keys of the piano, let's say you can't play the note C. So I can show you a piano and say, look, Eric, when I take off these keys, I can't play the note C. Right. Therefore, what? The note C is in the piano. Like if I open the piano, like, oh, look, here it is. I found it. Or, I go to play guitar, I get on stage and I say, oh, guys, time out. Hold on. The note C, it must have dropped out of my guitar. It's in my car. Let me go run and get it. No. So just because there's a cause and effect or dependent relationship doesn't follow that the mind is the brain or is in the brain. It only follows there's a cause and effect relationship. So yeah, a substance dualist like myself has no to find things like this. But again, cause and effect relationships do not establish identity. They only establish cause and effect. And I would even argue it's a two-way street, especially when you go into free will, which we don't have to, but on my channel, I have like a 2.5-hour video on the soul you can watch. I think it's like the case for the soul or something, where we do talk about free will. But yeah, all that does is show that there's a cause and effect relationship. It doesn't establish identity. It doesn't prove that consciousness is in the brain. It just shows there's a correlation.
Yeah. And when I even think about looking at your same arguments, I think about when they did take that part of the brain out of the rat, if you looked at that, you don't see any memories on that part of the brain. It's like there's something gone there. So, and I also have got 3 questions that people ask. A couple of them are really quick questions.
Sure.
And then there's one that's a little bit, So one of them is, actually, I'll just ask all 3. Which Bible version do you use? And then also, do you believe in an immortal soul? And then the last one is, what would you recommend as a good intro to Christian philosophy?
Which Bible translation do I use? The one that's in front of me. I don't have a preference. I like the ESV, NIV. I grew up on King James, like I think maybe most people around here did. So, you know, I have a new King James that I like to use. But I don't think, I'll say this: I'm not educated enough to know which one is the best. I would ask someone like Michael Ancona or something like that, who I've become friends with over the past few years as well. He's spoken at our conferences. I like to look at the Amplified just to see if there's anything that it puts differently. But I would say if you really want to study the Bible, the best way to do it is to look at the original Greek and Hebrew, which you don't have to necessarily know Greek and Hebrew. You can go to blueletterbible.com and you can look at the Greek and Hebrew words. You can look at commentaries on it. So I think that'd be the best way to have any kind of a really good, robust study of scripture. The other question was, do I believe in an immortal soul? And I think that's a really good question because people tend to assume that the soul is by its nature immortal. I don't think it is. Now, to answer the question, do I believe in an immortal soul? For human beings, yes. And that is because I believe that we are made in the image of God, which is a reason I would reject the annihilationist position. If for those that know, is a view that at the end, when God judges you, hell is basically wiping you out of existence, so to speak, annihilating you. I reject that because I think it would be immoral of God to wipe out something made in his image. Nevertheless, I believe that human beings are immortal or everlasting. They're going to be eternal, but only because of the fact that God chose to make these souls on his image. Now, this brings up the sad question, do animals go to heaven? I don't know. I'd hope so. It'd be nice. I'd love to see some of my pets, but I can't say for certain whether they do or not, but they do have souls. So are souls just by their nature immortal? No. But I do think given that we are made in God's image, yes, we are immortal, not because simply we're souls or material, but because we're made in God's image and God's not going to annihilate something like that out of existence.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that. I think, I'll just say I agree with you. That's a good point. Do you have a good actually, somebody else is asking about the Trinity too, how you explain the Trinity.
I can hear you. I'm gonna go grab the book real quick.
Okay.
Were you saying this Trinity?
Well, the Christian philosophy book is one thing, but where was that Trinity question? Let me just see if can you use this relationship of identity to explain how Jesus, God, and the Holy Spirit being all and the same?
Yes. To answer that question. So my absolute favorite book on philosophy is Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview, written by my two favorite philosophers and theologians, J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig. And got both.
Oh, wow. They co-authored a book?
A book, yeah.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Got both their signatures here. And you can see how much I've used it and read it. Yeah, this is probably my absolute favorite. It really gets into, I think, the essentials. My favorite book on the soul is Body and Soul by J.P. Moreland and Scott B. Ray, Human Nature and the Crisis of Ethics. Also a book that I have just really dug into and, really, sorry, it's flipped. I can't. Anyways, yeah, that's two of my favorite books there. Trinity. Yeah. So, okay. So you may have heard, who was it? Was it Bill Clinton? I think who's famous for saying it depends on what the word is, and people kind of made fun of him for that. Never thought I'd say this, but Bill Clinton was right, and that was very smart of him to point out the distinction. And actually, this book does go into those distinctions. The Philosophical Foundations book. There are different types of ises. The easiest way to put it, if I could say something like, so if I said Eric is Kendall Hernandez's husband, that's my wife, then that is an is of identity. So Eric is Kendall's husband. So that's an is of identity. Then you have an is of something like an is of, I forget the exact word, like Constitution. The paper is white, or the statue is made of marble. That is an is of constitution. Then you have an is of predication, which is, I think, the type of is we use with the Trinity. So if I say Eric is Kendall's husband, that's an is of identity. But if I say Eric is human, I'm not saying I am 7 billion people. So that's not an is of identity. That's an is of predication, meaning meet all the requirements of what it means to be human. When we say Jesus is God, I think we're using an is a predication, that Jesus has all the requirements of what it, Jesus meets all the requirements of what it means to be a divine person, to be part of the Godhead. So it's not, so when we say Jesus is God, it's not an is of identity. It's an is of predication. Just like Eric is human and Eric is Kendall's husband are not the same types of ises.
Yeah. I think that makes a good argument. It's a tough one looking at the Trinity and trying to explain that to people, because they don't get the essence of three beings in one, essentially, or the essence of three beings in one. And I kind of like that. It might be old, but it's going back to St. Patrick's idea of the shamrock is sort of one way to put that together. That kind of people can relate to. At least the Irish could relate to that when he did that. Oh, are you a Calvinist? Susan's wanting to know.
No, I've really chosen to reject that doctrine. Interesting, because I was, and I don't laugh because, so I have lots of Calvinist friends and I love them. I laugh just because that I do get that question often. Some people, depending on who you talk to and what you're talking about, but I'm going on a tangent there. No, I'm not. And I was even tempted to bring up, that in part of the discussion, because there's a lot of issues I have with Calvinism. Before I ever studied any serious theology, I studied philosophy. That was the first. I told you the story of how I came into apologetics, and that really made me fall in love with I fell in love with philosophy before anything else. And I was a Christian, so of course. Anyways, so I had my metaphysical ducks lined up in a row before I came to studying serious theology. And when I began to learn about things like free will and stuff like that, and I heard that there are people who believed in like determinism, like Calvinists, I thought, oh, well, that's probably some fringe movement or something that was long ago. And when I began to meet Calvinists, I was like, really? Do you know what you believe? Like, wow. So I was shocked by it. But here's where I was going to bring it up in relevance to what we're saying. So, and I don't want to misrepresent anyone. There have been Calvinists I talked to, because some people are going to say, well, that's not the version of Calvinism I hold to. My boss, Leighton Flowers, by the way, he has a podcast and channel called Soteriology 101. He is a former Calvinist who came out of Calvinism, and he's done great stuff on there, wrote a couple books on it. And I would recommend his work. But so some people are going to say that you can only be saved if you're elect. And if you're not elect, they're going to essentially have to say it's impossible for you to be saved. Now, the reason I would reject that is because when we go back to nature, I think this is going to sound harsh, and I don't mean it to. I think Calvinism stems from a lot of bad philosophy, and I think bad theology is a result of bad philosophy, especially bad metaphysics. Are you a Calvinist, by the way, SJ?
No, I'm a Molinist.
Okay, good. Because I just thought, whoa, I didn't even ask you as a Calvinist. I'm saying all this stuff. Okay, great. Yeah, same here, Molinism. Although I think that the two are compatible. That's another, they can be, but that's a whole nother discussion. Molinism is a whole nother discussion, which I've talked about on my channel. Okay.
But I just want to say though, you're right on the determinism problem, because that's why I'm not a Calvinist, but I'll let you keep explaining that, because then I'll explain why I agree with you.
Yeah. There's a lot of reasons we can go to. I'm just going to bring it up in relevance to what we're talking about. So I've had people say, well, no, it would be logically impossible for you to be saved if you're not elect. And I say, well, depending on how they mean it, but let me put it this way. I hear the term nature being thrown around a lot, especially in those kind of discussions. And again, I think they have a misunderstanding. I think a lot of people misunderstand what a nature is. It's a metaphysical term that means something specific. If I like to ask it this way, I say, how many human natures are there? Well, one. Right? I mean, there's not more than one human nature. If you're human, then you have the nature of a human being. There's not like more than one. Right. Okay. So that means everybody that is human is going to have a human nature, and a human nature contains certain capacities that are going to be universal throughout what it means to be human. If person A is elect and person B is not elect, well, on the Calvinist view, only person A can be saved. However, if person A and person B are both human persons, then they both, metaphysically speaking, have it within their nature to be saved. I would argue it is a metaphysical fault to say it's only logically possible for one person to be saved and not the other, when they both share the same. And the very thing that grounds your capacities of nature, like being able to be saved is the very fact that you're a human person. So if we're all share a human nature, then it is logically possible for everyone to be saved.
Okay.
And some would go as far as say, no, it's impossible for other people who are not elect to be saved. And I think, well, it's one thing to say God's not going to, but it's another thing to say that they just can't be. No, they can be. It's just on the Calvinist view, if it were true, at best you can say God's not going to, but you can't say that they can't be saved. And there's a lot more to it, but I mean, yeah.
I agree with you. And I think just the very fact we have free will speaks to God giving us that chance to be saved and to make that choice. But I want to add on to what you're saying with that determinism idea, because one of the big arguments that Calvinists have is they'll say, what they do is they freeze God in time. And they basically claim that, they put God onto a linear timeline like we're on and say, well, God knows what we're going to do. Well, God's omnipresent. And I think that's something that people have a hard time grasping, because he knows what we would, will, and could do under varying circumstances. And he puts us in varying circumstances to maximize the potential for us doing something good. But I also want to say on that end, so God, because he's omnipresent, he's seen us already. So he knows our actions. He knows who's going to be saved because he's already seen us live out our entire lives and make all the decisions we've made. So that to people is hard to grasp. I think it's like C.S. Lewis talking about an author of a book. He knows the book of the earth and he knows how it's going to end. and he's he's omnipresent as a looker of the book, or an author of the book, I should say. Does that make sense to you?
I do get the sentiment. I'd have to, so I would disagree with C.S. Lewis when it comes to that version. And again, this would be an entirely different discussion, but I guess to kind of give you some, my own thoughts here. And that's something I enjoy studying too, Molinism. Again, I come from more of a philosophical background. So these kind of things are things I've tried my best to work out and work through. Now, when it comes to God being omniscient, a Calvinist objection towards something like Molinism or even Arminianism is that you have God looking in order to have knowledge. I reject Arminianism as I understand it and Calvinism as I understand it, because I think when it comes to God's knowledge becomes, God's not omniscient necessarily. I think part of the attribute of God is to be omniscient necessarily, and there was never a time that he was not omniscient, so to speak. I think on the Calvinist view, God is only omniscient because he causes things to happen. Well, then that means that he doesn't know it unless he causes it. Well, that's not, I would argue that's not true omniscience. I'm kind of just simplifying it. If some Arminians say, well, God knows it because he looked forward in time or looked down the corridors of time, well, then now you have God having a perceptual view of knowledge, which is based on his looking into something. So I reject both those views of knowledge. I take, as a Molinist especially, that God is just omniscient necessarily. It's inherently part of what it means to be God. Again, I'm simplifying, running through that. That being said, I would agree with what you're saying that God, in other words, we can explain how does God know the future without infringing on our free will, which I think is, I don't want to say a dumb question, but I do want to say that just for simplicity's sake, because there's no contradiction there. But a couple ways you can explain it is you can say, well, God knows us so well, he knows what we're going to do with 100% certainty, accuracy, however you want to put it. So it's like my wife. I know that if I bought my wife, my wife flowers, if I spent like $1,000 on flowers, my wife's actually going to be upset at me because she doesn't really like receiving flowers. It's not her thing, which is fine. But if I bought her a really nice card and wrote like 10 pages on why I love her, she would love that because I know my wife and I know how she'll react to certain things. You can say the same with God. Or you can say God just knows everything necessarily, including the counterfactual decisions of what would make. So it's not that he has to quote see or look. It's just that he is omniscient necessarily, and he knows what we're going to do before we do it. But that doesn't infringe on our free will, because infringing on our free will would be that he causes us to do it, but knowledge isn't causal. So as long as we're free and we're first movers in what we do, which is how I define freedom, again, separate discussion, then whether or not he has foreknowledge doesn't infringe on my freedom because knowledge doesn't cause something to come into existence.
I think that seems logical. That makes sense. I've got two questions here, and these will probably have to be the last questions, but does Eric believe in middle knowledge? Susan wants to know. And this other one says, do Calvinists even worship the same God? Isn't the Calvinist version of love and justice totally different than the biblical version of love and justice?
I'll answer the first question, and we might not have time for the second. No, I'm just joking. I'm joking. Yes. So Molinism, an essential part of Molinism is middle knowledge. And I have to find where I wrote it down somewhere. I wrote down two what I think in my mind are necessary conditions for Molinism, and necessary and sufficient conditions. And one of them is having middle knowledge. And I think it was having middle knowledge, I think logically prior to, I forgot, I don't want to butcher it. I have to look at the notes I wrote down, but I don't even think libertarian free will is necessary for Molinism to be true, because I would argue at its core, Molinism is a view of God's omniscience, not a view of human freedom. While it has implications to human freedom, it's not necessary. That's why I say I think you can be a Calvinist and still be a Molinist, because all it would take is for God to know what we would do had he created a world of free creatures, and then decide, nope, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go with the Calvinist world and create that world. Molinism would still be true, given the fact that he had middle knowledge logically prior to creation and knew what a person with free will would do had he created those creatures. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Does that make, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I want to say hi to your friendly neighborhood atheist, because I'm going to be on his channel on the 25th. So he just showed up in the chat. So, and then the other question was, do you think that the Calvinist God is the same as, you think Calvinism is biblical, might even be the way that this is being asked?
So no, I don't think it's biblical. And that's not necessarily like a condemning or damning or heretical thing to say, because some people say, well, is X, Y, or Z biblical? Well, one, it's, I'm curious why people ask. So for example, is drinking coffee biblical? Well, if by biblical, you mean, is it in the Bible or prescribed in the Bible? No, it's not. But, that doesn't mean it's wrong or heretical. It's so something can be, quote, unbiblical and still be true. If by unbiblical, you simply mean it's not taught in scripture or something like that. Calculus isn't taught in scripture. So I'd first say, no, I don't think it's biblical. Now, I do think that scripture teaches against a lot of the core tenets of Calvinism. And let me, in defense of my Calvinist friends, while I do think that what they believe is false, I do think what they believe is wrong, I wouldn't go as far as to say they worship a different God. I would just say that their concept of certain attributes about God are misinformed or just incorrect or false, but not necessarily that they worship a different God. Because so for example, if you and I sat down together and we wrote down everything we believe about God, I'm pretty sure that we're going to have some disagreements, and that's fine. I'm pretty sure you get 10 people in a room, they're going to have disagreements about God. Does it follow that therefore they're worshiping a different God? No. Now, do I think the concept of love on the Calvinist view is a concept of love that's described in the Bible? No. But I understand what they're trying to say and the sentiment behind what they're trying to get at, where they're trying to magnify God, God's sovereignty, God's holiness. I get that. I grant that. I appreciate that, because I think we should. But I think it's at the cost of another attribute. So they're not saying that God doesn't have these loving attributes. They're just saying that these attributes are in line with that attribute, and some may even go as far as to say maybe outweigh attributes, and that gets into again another can of worms. And I just, there's worms all over the place now. I talk too much, but
no, it's all good. I like all the stuff you're saying. You've got a lot of knowledge on a lot of different topics, so it's interesting.
I don't think I just make stuff up and hope people don't notice, to be honest. That's what you do when you study philosophy. But so, yeah. So no, I think they worship the same God. I just think they're wrong about certain attributes of God. Leighton Flowers, my boss, he says something really interesting once. He said, if God tells us to love our enemies and love those who persecute you, then why wouldn't he do that himself? And I think on the Calvinist view, again, depending on who you talk to, but yeah, God does hate people, and God hates his enemies, which I even think, should I say this? I'm going to say it. I already started the sentence. I think the Calvinist view of God is eerily close to the Muslim conception of God. That doesn't necessarily make it false by association, but I think there are a lot of similar characteristics. And I think an honest Calvinist would agree, when it comes to like determinism and God being able to do what he wants and hating his enemies in that sense. But yeah.
Yeah. That's very interesting. And you're right. We could go way, way down a lot of tangents talking about determinism and free will and all these different other topics, because there's so many fascinating topics. And I'm glad that you've come on my channel today. I just want to say thank you so much. And so everybody in the chat, I want to say thank you to everybody who's in the chat. And for all your time. Actually, we went overtime to what I was initially planning with you. And so this is good, because we covered so many different things that I think that this has enlightened a lot of people onto philosophy. If anything that happened out of today is people are going to want to get those books you've been reading.
Yeah, I hope so. They're great books. I love it. And I love philosophy. C.S. Lewis said, good philosophy must exist, if for no other reason, because bad philosophy exists and must be answered. And I think a lot of positions are based on bad philosophy, whether it's a doctrine I disagree with, like Calvinism, or whether it's an atheistic perspective I disagree with, like physicalism. I think it's based on bad philosophy. And the greatest commandment says to love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Part of the greatest commandment is to love God with your mind. So if you want to fulfill the greatest commandment, not the greatest suggestion, but the greatest commandment, we all need to grow in our thinking, in our knowledge, and our understanding, because that is part of what it means to be a Christian and to love God and to fulfill the greatest commandment Christ gave. So I tell people, if you want to be like Christ, you got to study some philosophy and apologetics. And if you don't like it, take it up with the author, not me. I just read the book. I didn't write it. I'm just a messenger. So.
You're just a messenger. Yeah, that's funny. That's so yeah, and same with me. I'm just a messenger, and so anyway, it'll be funny when I go to look at the chat and how this all turns out in the comments later, because with you on here, because I have certain atheists who never seem to show up in my chats, but yet they fill up the comment section. So I'm looking forward to reading the comments. There's one guy, I'm just gonna say his name because he's gonna show up in my comments, because he does every time. His name's David, and he's got a bunch of numbers after his name. And every video that I post, he shows up later and he puts in about 10, 15 comments of him going through the video with timestamps pretty much. I mean,
oh, it's fun. It's just good.
So hi, David. I'm going to say this in advance in case you catch this part. So anyway, I want to say thank you so much. And so I'm going to make sure I've got links to your Twitter channel. I'm going to make sure I've got links to your YouTube and all that kind of stuff. Is there a blog or anything else we should link?
I have a website that I had made a number of years ago before Texas Baptist. I've always felt called to ministry, so I was just doing what I could. I haven't blogged on there in probably a couple of years. I had someone else who would write some articles for me, a young lady who was really brilliant, and I wanted to give her a platform. I say all that to say, EricHernandezMinistries.com. You can go there if you'd like. There's nothing necessarily new or relevant that you can't find anywhere else. The only thing on there that people might be interested in is I have some sermons on there and stuff like to I think like for like a digital download to purchase or something like that. Because I've had people who are overseas. Anyways, I'm getting on a tangent, but someone one time overseas wanted something I had, a hard copy of it, and it cost like $1,003 to ship overseas. So it was easier to just upload it and let them get it there. But yeah, no, YouTube, just Eric Hernandez, youtube.com/c/Eric Hernandez. Facebook page is Eric Hernandez TXB Ministries, or Twitter. I can say Twitter is what I check the least. Not that I don't check it at all, but it's something I've started doing with the past year or so that I'm still even getting used to. But yeah, any one of those, you can find me on there.
Great. That's awesome. And so, yeah, so thank you so much for coming on. I as I mentioned to anyone who joined here, you've been in a lot of different debates. People can find you online pretty easily. You go to the Modern Day Debate. You've been on, you debated Matt Dillahunty, for example, and some other people. So you can find a lot of Eric online. So you've got a good presence online.
Well, thank you. Yeah. And all my debates, most, if not all my debates I have on my channel. There's a few other, there's one I might put on my channel soon, but yeah, everything you can find on my channel, or like you said, Modern Day Debate. Dillahunty, I debated in Houston when I lived there at a church. So that wasn't a Modern Day Debate, but David Smalley, I've debated David Smalley, Matt Dillahunty, and Arn Raw, or some of the quote big names I've debated. There's talk of me possibly debating somebody. I don't know if maybe Dan Barker. I already said it.
Oh,
so,
wow.
But nothing's been confirmed yet. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'll definitely watch that. And I've seen some of your smaller name debates too. So you've debated people like T-Jump and Skylar Fiction. And
oh yeah.
that. So yeah, you're very active debating, and you do a great job at it. So I appreciate that you're in the Christian community making a lot of noise.
Thank you. Some people think that's all it is. Maybe it is. I don't know, but
yeah,
thank you. I appreciate it.
Good, healthy noise. All right. Well, everybody, thank you so much for coming on. Please like and subscribe, and do come again. And I'm going to go ahead and end the stream. Here we go. Okay, now it's over. So